December 7, 1941. 353 Japanese aircraft lifted off from 6 carriers in the pre-dawn darkness north of Hawaii. When it was over, the United States Pacific Fleet had lost 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and nearly 200 aircraft, all sitting on the ground. Japan lost 29 planes. 29, against the most powerful naval base in the Pacific. In the days that followed, while Washington was still counting its dead, military analysts on both sides were asking the same question. How? Part of the answer was planning. Part of it was surprise. But a large part of it, a part that American pilots would spend the next 18 months learning the hard way, was a single aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. And this is not a story about Pearl Harbor. This is a story about how the greatest fighter plane Japan ever built became the weapon that helped destroy them. Not because it failed, because it was too good, designed so perfectly for one moment in time that it could never survive the next. To understand what the Zero meant in 1941, you have to understand what air combat looked like before it. Carrier-based fighters in the late 1930s were, by and large, compromises. They were built heavy because carriers demanded sturdy landing gear, folding wings, and the structural strength to survive a hard-deck landing at sea. They were built cautious because naval doctrine still hadn't fully decided whether the airplane or the battleship was the future of sea power. The American F-4F Wildcat, the best carrier fighter the United States had at the start of the war, was a tough, reliable machine. Pilots trusted it. It was also slower than it needed to be, less maneuverable than it should have been, and outclassed, badly, by what was waiting for it over the Pacific. The Zero was something else entirely. Its range was staggering. With external drop tanks, the Zero could fly over 1,900 miles, a distance no other carrier fighter in the world could come close to matching. To put that in terms that means something, a Zero launched from a carrier off the coast of Japan could fly to Korea, engage in combat, and return home. American planners, when they first ran the numbers, assumed the Japanese must be refueling somewhere in secret. The idea that a carrier aircraft could simply fly that far didn't fit anything they thought they knew. But it was the performance in close combat that made experienced pilots go quiet when they talked about it. The Zero could turn. Not just turn well, turn in a way that defied what Western engineers believed was aerodynamically possible for a machine of its size. In a low-speed turning engagement, the kind that dominated early Pacific air combat, a Zero pilot could get behind almost anything. He didn't need superior speed, he didn't need altitude, he just had to get you into a turning fight. And if you let him do that, the engagement was already over. Commander John Thack, one of the finest naval aviators the United States produced in World War II, described his first real encounter with the Zero in simple terms. He said it felt like the other pilot wasn't following the same rules of physics. Thatch was so shaken by what he saw that he went back to his quarters, got out a box of matches, and spent the night on the floor of his cabin working out a new way to fight. A completely new tactical doctrine, built from scratch on a wooden floor with matchsticks, because the old one would get his men killed. That doctrine became known as the Thatch Weave. It is still studied today. No aircraft in the history of American naval aviation had ever forced that kind of response. Not one. The man behind the Zero was a 40-year-old engineer from Nagoya named Jiro Horikoshi. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy handed him a specification that most of his colleagues considered impossible. They wanted a carrier fighter with a top speed of over 300 miles per hour. They wanted it to climb to 10,000 feet in 3.5 minutes. They wanted a range that could support operations deep over China, far beyond what any existing engine and airframe combination could provide. And they wanted it to outmaneuver and outfight every fighter currently in service anywhere in the world. Horikoshi looked at those requirements. He looked at the engines available to him, and he understood immediately that there was only one way to make all of those numbers work. He would have to cut weight, not trim it, not reduce it carefully. Cut it deeply, systematically, in places that every engineer understood were not supposed to be cut. What he built was a masterpiece, arguably the finest expression of pre-war fighter design the world had ever seen. And hidden inside every elegant line of it, inside every gram he shaved, every safety margin he erased, were three engineering decisions that would eventually kill thousands of the men who flew it. The Zero didn't fail Japan. Japan built it perfectly. That was the problem. In the spring of 1942, a young American intelligence officer named Joseph Rochefort was handed a translated document pulled from a downed Japanese aircraft over China. It was a maintenance manual for the Zero. Rochefort passed it to a small team of aeronautical engineers at Naval Air Station Anacostia in Washington. They read it carefully. Then they read it again. Then one of them set it down on the table and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "They didn't put any armor in it. Not reduced armor, not lighter armor, none." To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what armor meant to a fighter pilot in 1942. A German Bf-109, the backbone of the Luftwaffe, carried a steel plate behind the pilot's head, 8 millimeters thick, enough to stop a rifle-caliber round at combat range. A British Spitfire had armored glass in the windscreen and a reinforced bulkhead between the pilot and the engine. These were not luxuries. They were the lessons of Spain, of France, of the Battle of Britain, paid for in the lives of men who died without them. The Zero had none of it. No plate behind the head, no armored glass, no reinforced bulkhead. Just the pilot, a thin aluminum skin, and whatever faith he carried with him into the cockpit. There was a second omission. Most modern fighters by 1942 carried self-sealing fuel tanks, a rubber lining inside the tank that would swell and close around a bullet hole before the fuel could ignite. The technology wasn't new. The Germans had it. The British had it. The Americans had it. The Zero did not. A single incendiary round into the right place, and the aircraft became, in the words of more than one American after-action report, a flying torch. The fire was instantaneous. The pilot rarely had time to get out. Horikoshi was not careless. He was not ignorant. He understood exactly what he was trading away. The 1937 specification had left him no room to carry the weight. Armor, self-sealing tanks, reinforced structure. Add all of it together and the Zero becomes a different airplane. Slower, shorter range, less maneuverable. In other words, by the Navy's requirements, not a Zero at all. So Horikoshi made the only choice the specification allowed him. He built an aircraft optimized to never be hit. The Zero would win by not being there when the enemy pulled the trigger. It would outturn, outclimb, outrange anything it faced, and it would do so before the other pilot ever got a shot off. On paper, in 1941, against everything the Allies had, that logic was sound. The problem was that logic only works until the other side figures out the rules. It took the Americans roughly 6 months. The answer came not from a grand battle, but from a quiet, grinding process. Debrief after debrief, after-action report after after-action report. Pilots sitting across from intelligence officers in canvas-walled tents, describing in patient detail what it felt like to fight a Zero and survive. The answer, almost every time, was the same. Don't turn with it. Dive. Attack from altitude. Fire 1 burst into the cockpit or the fuel tank. Pull out and climb. Don't stay. Don't circle. Don't give it a chance to bring that turn radius to bear. 1 pass, 1 burst, gone. The tactic had a name eventually, the boom and zoom, and it worked because the Zero, stripped of everything that might have saved its pilot, could not survive the kind of attack it was never designed to face. A single .50 caliber round through an unarmored cockpit ended the engagement. A single incendiary into an unsealed tank ended the pilot. The aircraft that had seemed almost supernatural over Pearl Harbor and the Philippines and Malaya was, when you understood its construction, not supernatural at all. It was fragile. Precisely, deliberately, necessarily fragile, because fragility was the price Horikoshi paid for everything that made it great. On June 4, 1942, a 20-year-old Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga was flying escort during an attack on American positions in the Aleutian Islands. His Zero took hits from ground fire. The oil pressure dropped. He knew he wasn't going to make it back to the carrier. He brought the aircraft down on Akaton Island, a flat, grassy stretch that from altitude looked solid. It wasn't. The ground was soft. The landing gear dug in on contact. The Zero flipped forward, inverted, and Tadayoshi Koga died, not in combat, not in fire, but in the dirt of an island most Americans couldn't find on a map. His aircraft was nearly intact. A Navy salvage team reached it weeks later, pulled it free, crated it up, and shipped it to North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego. There, a team of engineers spent the next 3 months taking it apart piece by piece. They weighed every component. They measured every structural member. They documented every place where the armor should have been and wasn't. When they were done, they wrote a report that confirmed everything the pilots had already figured out in the skies over Guadalcanal. The Zero was not invincible. It was fast. It was nimble. It had extraordinary range. And it would burn or break or kill its pilot at the first serious mistake, because Jiro Horikoshi had been given a specification with no room for second chances. The Americans shared that report up and down the chain of command. Every fighter squadron in the Pacific received it. Training programs were rewritten around it. New tactics were built on top of it. The Zero hadn't changed. That was the problem the Americans were counting on, because while they were reading the Akutan report and drawing conclusions, Zero production in Japan was running at full speed, rolling the same aircraft, with the same emissions, off the same assembly lines, month after month, year after year. And the reason for that was not stubbornness or ignorance or a failure of engineering talent. It was something built into the aircraft itself, and into the organization that built it. That is the second flaw. In the fall of 1942, the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York, received an unusual request from the United States Navy. Build us a new fighter. Not an upgrade to the Wildcat, not a modification. Something new, designed from the beginning to kill the Zero. The chief engineer assigned to the project was a methodical, soft-spoken man named William Schwendler. Schwendler had read the combat reports from the Pacific. He had studied the performance data. He understood precisely what the Zero could do, and more importantly, what it couldn't. He sat down with his team and asked a question that Jiro Horikoshi had never been allowed to ask. What is this aircraft going to face 5 years from now? And how do we make sure it can handle that, too? The answer became the F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was, by almost every traditional measure, an inferior aircraft to the Zero. It weighed nearly twice as much. It was less maneuverable at low speed. It couldn't match the Zero's range. Experienced Japanese pilots, when they first encountered it in 1943, were not particularly impressed. They had seen heavier American fighters before. What they hadn't seen, what they couldn't see from the outside, was what Schwendler had built into the Hellcat that had nothing to do with its current performance. He had built room for a more powerful engine, room for additional armor, room for heavier armament, room for the instruments and electronics that engineers already knew were coming. The Hellcat's fuselage was wider than it needed to be. Its engine mount was stronger than its current engine required. Its electrical system had capacity well beyond what the 1942 version of the aircraft actually used. Schwendler wasn't building a fighter for 1942. He was building a platform, something that could absorb the lessons of combat and become a different, better machine without ever leaving the assembly line. Between 1942 and 1945, the Hellcat went through continuous improvement. The early model gave way to a later, faster version. Engine output increased. Armor was added. The cowling was redesigned for better cooling at high speed. Each change was driven by the same process. Pilots reported a problem, engineers proposed a solution, the solution went into production. The cycle took months, not years. The Zero, in that same period, received no comparable upgrade. Not because Japanese engineers weren't capable, not because Horikoshi hadn't seen the problem, but because the Zero's airframe, pared down to the bone to meet that 1937 specification, had no room left. The engine mount couldn't accept a significantly more powerful engine without rebuilding the entire nose section. The fuselage couldn't carry meaningful armor without pushing the center of gravity past the point where the aircraft remained controllable. The electrical system had no spare capacity for the instruments and electronics that were becoming standard on American and British fighters by 1943. Every path to improvement led to the same conclusion: you would have to build a new airplane. The Japanese knew it. In 1942, Mitsubishi began development of a true successor to the Zero, designed without the compromises that had crippled its predecessor. It first flew in May of 1944. By then, the Hellcat had been in combat for 8 months. By then, the war in the Pacific had 14 months left. The successor never entered operational service. The numbers tell the rest of the story. When the Hellcat entered combat in August of 1943, the kill ratio between American and Japanese carrier fighters was roughly even, a brutal, costly back and forth that neither side was clearly winning. By the spring of 1944, it wasn't even anymore. On June 19th and 20th, 1944, in the waters west of the Mariana Islands, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched the largest carrier airstrike of the entire Pacific War. 473 aircraft in coordinated waves aimed at the American fleet supporting the invasion of Saipan. What happened next entered the history books under a name that American pilots gave it themselves, with the casual, terrible humor of men who had stopped being afraid of something they had once feared greatly. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost somewhere between 550 and 600 aircraft over those 2 days, the exact count still debated by historians. The United States lost 23. There are battles that turn wars, and then there are battles that confirm what the math had already decided long before the first plane left the deck. Marianas was the second kind. The Hellcat that met the Zero over the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was not the Hellcat of 1942. It was faster. It was better armed. Its pilots were trained on everything 2 years of hard combat had taught. The Zero was the Zero of 1941, older, unimproved, carrying the same compromises, the same gaps in its armor, the same limits on its airframe, as the day it first flew. That is what 5 years of building room looks like against 5 years of building perfection. But the machines were only part of it. Because by June of 1944, the men sitting inside the Zero were not the men of 1941 either. And that story begins not on the assembly line and not in the cockpit, but in the way Japan chose to treat the pilots who were coming home. Or rather, the ones who still could. In the summer of 1943, a Navy fighter pilot named Alex Vrasiu returned to his carrier after an engagement over the Central Pacific. He was 23 years old. He had just shot down his third Japanese aircraft. Before he had finished removing his flight gear, an intelligence officer was waiting for him with a notepad. They sat down together for 2 hours. The officer asked about the engagement from the beginning: altitude, airspeed, angle of attack, where the rounds hit, how the Japanese pilot responded, what Vrasiu did right, what he might do differently next time. He asked whether the new gun settings were working as intended. He asked whether Vrasiu had any suggestions. That conversation, or one exactly like it, was happening on every American carrier after every engagement across the entire Pacific theater. The reports were compiled, patterns were identified, recommendations went to the manufacturer within weeks. Alex Vrasiu went on to become one of the leading aces of the Pacific War. 19 confirmed kills, the Navy Cross. A man the system had invested in understanding. On the other side of the Pacific, Saburo Sakai was preparing to fly his 64th combat mission. Sakai was, by any measure, one of the finest fighter pilots the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever produced, one of the few men alive who had been flying Zero combat missions since the very beginning, since China, since the opening days of the Pacific War. He had forgotten more about the Zero's real-world limits, the specific ways it was likely to get you killed against an opponent who had learned to fight it, than most engineers would ever know. Nobody asked him. Not in any systematic way, not with a notepad and 2 hours and a set of questions designed to turn his experience into something useful. When Sakai returned from a mission, he was given time to rest and then sent back up. His knowledge stayed with him, personal, unrecorded, inaccessible to the men designing the next version of the aircraft in a factory in Nagoya that might as well have been on the moon. This was not an accident. It was the result of 3 structural realities that ran through the Imperial Japanese military from top to bottom. The first was cultural. In the Japanese naval tradition of that era, a report of genuine failure, unvarnished, uncomfortable failure, carried a weight that went beyond professional consequence. It touched something deeper. Something that made officers at every level instinctively reshape the facts before passing them upward. Losses were minimized in the telling. Weaknesses were framed as temporary. The picture that reached senior commanders was consistently, systematically rosier than the picture that existed in the cockpits over Guadalcanal and Rabaul and the Solomons. After the catastrophic defeat at Midway in June 1942, 4 fleet carriers lost, the core of Japan's offensive air power gone in a single afternoon. The full scale of the disaster was withheld from the Japanese public for the duration of the war. Internally, the analysis that did occur was shaped more by the need to protect reputations than by the need to understand what had gone wrong. Decisions made in the months that followed were built on a foundation of information that had been quietly, carefully, fatally adjusted. The second reality was structural. Mitsubishi's design team worked in Nagoya. The war was being fought over islands most of those engineers had never seen on a map. There was no formal channel, no regular process, by which the experience of combat pilots made its way back to the drawing board in any timely way. When Horikoshi and his team eventually received performance data from active operations, it arrived months after the relevant engagements. Filtered, summarized, stripped of the specific ground-level detail that engineering decisions actually require. The men who could have told them exactly how the Zero was failing and where and why were flying the next mission. Or they were dead. The third reality was perhaps the most insidious. By 1942, the Zero was not just an aircraft, it was a symbol. It was the machine that had humiliated the United States at Pearl Harbor, that had swept the skies clean over Malaya and the Philippines, that had made Japanese air power the most feared in the Pacific. To acknowledge, formally and officially, that the Zero was falling behind, that it could no longer compete with what the Americans were flying, was not simply a technical concession. It was an admission that the strategy built around it had been wrong, that the war was going wrong. In an institution where delivering that message could end a career, or worse, nobody delivered it. Not clearly, not loudly, not in time. The consequences arrived on a precise schedule. In 1941, the average Japanese Navy fighter pilot had logged somewhere between 300 and 500 hours of flight time before entering combat. Many had combat experience from China. They were, by any standard, among the most proficient military aviators in the world. By late 1943, the attrition had become unsustainable. Those pilots, the ones who had built the legend of the Zero, were gone, dead or wounded or worn past the point of use. Replacements were coming out of training programs that had been compressed, first to 200 hours, then to 150, then lower still, because Japan was running short of the aviation fuel needed to train them properly. Young men with fewer than 150 hours in the cockpit were being sent to fly an aircraft that punished any mistake with fire or structural failure, against opponents with over 500 hours of flight time, in aircraft that were better, with tactics specifically designed to exploit every weakness the Zero had. The outcome was not a battle. It was arithmetic. Saburo Sakai survived the war. He was one of very few pilots from the early Zero squadrons who did. In his memoirs, written years after the surrender, he described watching the new pilots arrive at his unit in 1944. Boys, really, barely old enough to shave, climbing into the cockpit of an aircraft he already knew was killing men faster than the enemy was. He wrote that he wanted to tell them everything he had learned, every mistake to avoid, every situation that would get them killed before they understood what had gone wrong. He said he tried, sometimes, talking between missions, sharing what he could in the hours between flights. But there was no system for it, no structure, no process that turned what he knew into something that could change the aircraft or the training or the tactics in any way that might have mattered at the scale the war required. He knew what was wrong. He had known for 2 years. The organization around him simply had no way to hear it. 3 flaws: a frame too light to survive a single mistake, a design too perfect to accept a single improvement, and a system too rigid to act on a single honest report. Each one, alone, might have been managed. Together, they created something that could not be stopped from the inside, only from the outside. And by the time the outside arrived in force, there was one answer left, one terrible, final answer. That is what comes next. There is a word in Japanese, toko, that the Imperial Navy used in its official communications after the fall of 1944. It means, translated cleanly, special attack. It is a bureaucratic word, precise, neutral, institutional. It describes, in the language of naval administration, the act of loading an aircraft with explosives, pointing it at an enemy warship, and asking the man in the cockpit not to come back. The Americans called it kamikaze. The wind that saved Japan once, 7 centuries earlier, when a typhoon scattered the Mongol fleet before it could reach the shore. The name was chosen deliberately. It was meant to evoke destiny, providence, the hand of heaven intervening at the final hour. What it actually was, stripped of the poetry, was a logical conclusion. By late 1944, a conventional Zero attack against a properly defended American fleet had a survival rate that approached zero. The aircraft was outclassed. The pilots were undertrained. The tactics that might once have compensated for the Zero's limitations required a level of skill and experience that no longer existed in sufficient numbers to matter. A conventional attack cost Japan an aircraft and a pilot, and, more often than not, accomplished nothing. A Toko attack cost Japan an aircraft and a pilot, and had a meaningful chance of putting a ship out of action. In the calculus of a war Japan was already losing. The second option made more sense. That is the most honest way to say it. The aircraft that couldn't be fixed, flown by pilots who couldn't be properly trained, sent by a command structure that couldn't acknowledge how badly everything had gone, found its final use as a guided missile with a human being inside. 3 flaws, 1 conclusion. Between October 1944 and August 1945, these attacks sank 34 American ships and damaged nearly 370 others. They killed almost 5,000 American sailors, more than any other Japanese weapons system, in the final year of the war. By the cold measure of damage inflicted, they worked. They worked better than the Zero had in conventional combat since 1943. That fact sits in the historical record without mercy and without explanation. It simply sits there. Japan built 10,939 Zero fighters over the course of the war. Production never stopped, not when the kill ratios reversed, not when better American fighters arrived, not after the Marianas. The assembly lines kept turning out the same aircraft, the same airframe, the same compromises, the same beautiful, brittle machine, because there was nothing ready to replace it and no system capable of admitting, loudly enough, that it needed to be replaced. The last Zero rolled off the line in the summer of 1945, 2 months before the surrender. Jiro Horikoshi lived until January of 1982. He spent the post-war decades in a Japan rebuilt almost entirely by the same industrial discipline that had once built his aircraft. He wrote, he lectured. He was, in the careful and somewhat melancholy way of men who outlive the things they made, reflective about the Zero. In the book he wrote about the design process, he described with the clarity that only distance allows the fundamental nature of what he had been asked to do. He had been handed requirements that no existing engine could fully satisfy. He had been given no margin for safety, no room for growth, no allowance for the possibility that the war might last longer than 6 months, or that the enemy might learn, or that the world the Zero was designed for might not be the world it would have to fight in. He had been asked to build the perfect weapon for a specific moment in time, and he had done exactly that. The failure was not in the execution, it was in the question that nobody thought to ask. What happens when the moment passes? December 7th, 1941. 353 aircraft, 29 lost. The greatest single demonstration of carrier air power the world had ever seen, and at the center of it, 10,939 times over, from that morning until the last day of the war, an aircraft with no armor behind the pilot's head, no protection for its fuel, no capacity to become anything other than exactly what it already was. The Zero didn't lose the Pacific War. Japan lost the Pacific War for many reasons that had nothing to do with any single aircraft, but the Zero is the shape of how they lost it. A nation that built something perfect and then built it again, and again, and again, and again, long after the world had moved on and made that perfection irrelevant. The Mongol fleet was real. The divine wind that scattered it was real. But winds don't come on command, and this time no one thought to ask whether the weather had changed.